The Meshroom D is known for its modular design and great cooling capabilities, but with a giant CPU cooler and thick GPU, things get tricky. This build is aiming for one thing, silence, so I will make use of a 3D printer to build the quietest SFF PC I have ever made. Starting with the CPU, I went with the Ryzen 7 9700X for two simple reasons. First being, it delivers excellent performance. Second, it runs very efficient at a 65 watt TDP, helping us to keep the system cool and quiet. For the motherboard, I picked up the ASUS ROG B650E. At around $200, this motherboard is my preferred choice. It has a packed rear I/O and allows us to plug in up to 3 fan headers directly to the mainboard, which will be very handy, especially in an SFF build where cable management can become a nightmare. And as a bonus, it allows us to mount a second SSD for future storage upgrades on the back without having to put the build completely apart. I am using a Kingston Fury 32 gigs 5200 MHz CL40 RAM kit. This is not the sweet spot for my CPU, and I'm for sure losing some performance. Prices are so inflated that I was glad to find this kit used for $200 less than new, and it works. In today's economy, that's all I wanted. I took my old WD Black SN850 from my PS5 for this build. It is a great PCIe Gen 4 NVMe drive with great write and read speeds, but to be honest, I picked it for this build because I had it already. There is no more depth to it. At this point, I didn't know if the cooler would fit in the SSUPD Meshroom D. Noctua made the NH-D12L with SFF builds in mind, but the datasheet claims that the Meshroom D does not support this cooler. In fact, SSUPD themselves says the Meshroom D supports coolers up to a height of 142mm, while the NH-D12L is 145mm high, so we are talking about a 3mm difference. Mounting the NH-D12L is fairly simple. First, you got to remove those pre-installed cooler brackets. Then, you have to install 2 included brackets. This is a bit flimsy. I figured it's the easiest to hold the bracket with one hand straight and screw it in with the other hand. That way we make sure that we don't have to readjust the bracket afterwards, which would loosen the screw. You must make sure to put the right bracket on the north side of the CPU and the other one to the south side. Also, both brackets have 2 mounting positions depending on your CPU. It is described pretty good in the manual. You really cannot do it wrong. Before dropping the cooler on your CPU, you got to remove the pre-installed fan to make the necessary screws accessible. After that, there is nobody to hold you back. Drop it and tighten those screws. After putting the fan back into place, make sure it sits tight and do not forget to plug in the fan cable. As a PC builder, that's a lesson I learned the hard way. Man, did I struggle. Now look at this mighty giant. Air coolers have something to them that I kinda cannot describe in words. Aesthetics wise, I prefer some of them over AIOs, and especially this one. Before checking if the mainboard will fit with the Noctua NH-D12L into my case, I made sure my 3070 Ti will allow the installation of bottom fans. I just realized that you can't mount 120mm fans on the bottom without a bracket that is included in the packaging. But me, being a messy person, lost that valuable component. So I was playing around with a 140mm fan just to see how much space I got under my GPU. You see, the Founders Edition 3070 Ti, which is a 2-slot GPU, fits easily with a fan underneath. But what about my slightly thicker 2.5-slot RTX 5070? Unfortunately, this won't fit. Or does it? I could use low-profile fans, but I don't like them because of the noise levels, and also all I had were those normal-sized Noctua A12 Gen 2 fans. At this point, I already knew I will need a 3D-printed solution to be able to mount 120mm fans under my GPU. I was still planning on putting in my 3070 Ti in this build, while mounting the brackets on my fans, but then it clicked. Because I need brackets for the installation of 120mm fans, therefore I should be able to mount my fans in a half-sized position with a little offset of around 10mm. Take a look. With the brackets mounted, I slided the fan in between the original mounting position. As I said previously, since it's smaller than the 140mm frame, it fits perfectly with the Noctua A12. Now, I use the standard fan screws but don't tighten them up, so that we can keep a gap between the fan and my graphics card. It would be better to design a 3D model with standoffs for this purpose, but I didn't have the time to put in to optimize the model, which I found on the internet. In this configuration, the dust filter cannot be applied anymore. After installing my power supply, I decided to make some light cable management before putting in my motherboard. I let the zip ties a bit loose to make sure I still can move those cables around. I have to quickly correct a small mistake. The power supply was not mounted in the correct position. Quick fix. There we go. I also decided to put in a smaller 92mm Noctua NF-A9 fan as a rear exhaust fan to help channel the hot air of the CPU cooler and guide its way out. Now it's time to drop in this bad boy into its new home. For some reason I decided to plug in those front I/O cables before putting the motherboard in. Anyways, I had to fiddle around with the board to get my way around the exhaust fan and also around the power cables. Once that's done, the mainboard stays firm in its place and one should avoid touching it again. I am searching for a way to install one additional fan. I was afraid this would happen. The side fan brackets will not fit due to the height of the CPU cooler. I don't need a fan above the cooler, but I really would like to have one additional fan to get in more fresh air from my CPU. A quick Google search later and I got these. The modding community is cooking these days. We can use some of those free screw holes of the case's frame to mount our 3D printed brackets. Now it's time to drop in that 5070. And it fits perfectly. No pressure needed at all. That surprised me a bit since I was really expecting a tight fit with those fans installed. The moment of truth. It fits. But in this corner, it doesn't. There is no pressure coming from the cooler. The problem are the screws I was using for my 3D printed fan bracket. I used some random screws I found and their head is too big. I removed them for now and will replace them in the future. Now the case closes. Looks are always subjective, but I really like how this build turned out. The Meshroom D has a clean, understated design that doesn't try to draw any attention. Overall, it's exactly the kind of SFF build I like. Compact, understated, and built with performance and acoustics in mind. But that brings us to the real question. How does it actually sound? And more importantly, was all the effort worth it? I optimized the fan curves for every fan in the system, including the GPU. At idle, and even while editing this video, the PC remains completely inaudible. My ambient noise floor is 28 decibels and the system doesn't raise it at all. Gaming is a different story. The PC does become audible, but it only reaches 34 to 35 decibels. Considering my room temperature was 31 degrees Celsius or 87.8 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a result I'm really happy with. The trade-off is temperature. After 2 hours of benchmarking, both the CPU and GPU settle at around 80 degrees Celsius. Those aren't particularly impressive numbers, but the unusually high ambient temperature certainly plays a role. More importantly, both components are still comfortably below that thermal throttling limits, so performance remains completely unaffected. Overall, I'd call this a success. For a high-end SFF system, it's incredibly quiet while still delivering all the performance I expect.